Have you ever thought about how men fed entire families from rivers they'd never laid eyes on before, with nothing in their packs but a knife and whatever they could cut from the trees around them? The Lewis and Clark expedition covered over 8,000 miles of unfamiliar territory between 1804 and 1806. Their journals describe fishing methods passed down through frontier guides, techniques developed over generations in country where failing to eat didn't mean a bad day on the water. It meant your family went hungry through winter. Some of what those men used is legal today. Several techniques are not. All of them work, and every single one of them works for the same reason. These men didn't have gear. They had knowledge. They understood where fish were, why fish held where they held, and what triggered them to eat. That understanding made every tool on this list function, and every tool on this list fails without it. We'll get to why at the end, because the final technique isn't a rig or a trap or a piece of equipment at all. A guide on the White River in the Ozarks told me it's the one skill he'd give up his entire tackle collection for. I'll explain why when we get there. The oldest fishing hook in the human record doesn't look like anything in your tackle box. It doesn't bend. It has no eye, no barb, no curve. It's a straight piece of bone or hardwood, sharpened at both ends, roughly the length of your thumbnail, about half an inch. That is a gorge hook. The concept sounds too simple to work. You bury the gorge inside a piece of bait. The fish swallows it whole. As the line tightens, the gorge rotates sideways inside the stomach. It locks. The fish can't back off a gorge the way it backs off a J-hook because there's no bend to push against. The gorge turns until it finds resistance, and it anchors. Archaeological finds place gorge hooks at least 23,000 years back. Lewis and Clark's journals from 1804 document their frontier guides using them along the upper Missouri River when the expedition's metal hook supply ran low or was lost to snags. The guides made them from bird leg bones and from the thorns of honey locust trees, which grow straight with a natural taper toward the tip, sometimes 4 to 5 inches long, roughly from your first knuckle to the tip of your thumb, and dense enough to hold against a running catfish. The mechanism is worth understanding because it explains something about modern tackle that most anglers never connect. A circle hook, the style fisheries biologists recommend for catch and release because it tends to set in the corner of the mouth rather than the throat, works on the same rotational geometry as the gorge. Fish moves away, line angle changes, hook rotates until it finds purchase. Different shape, same underlying logic. Your $4 circle hook from the bait shop is a variation on something worked out 23,000 years ago. The manufacturer did not put that on the packaging. Where gorge hooks fail is with any fish that mouths bait carefully before swallowing. Basin trout will pick up a piece of cut bait, feel the foreign object, and drop it before committing. Catfish and carp, which tend to inhale bait and sort it out after, are the right target. Frontier guides used gorge rigs almost exclusively for channel cats and rough fish in deep river channels, and specifically in current where the fish would run hard after taking the bait rather than sit still. If you've ever lost a catfish right at the bank, that moment where it spit the hook just as you were reaching down for it, the gorge hook was built to prevent exactly that. The fish can't feel what it can't find the edge of. The rotation happens after the line tightens. By then, it's already too late for the fish to do anything about it. One thing you should know: frontier lines attached to gorge hooks were not hook and line in the modern sense. They were sinew, braided bark cordage, or twisted plant fiber. No reel, no rod. A short length of line tied to a stake or wrapped around a root, baited, and left. The gorge worked because it didn't require a fisherman to stand there holding it. You've probably set a rod in a rod holder or leaned it against a tree, walked 30 feet down the bank to check another line, and come back to find something already took the bait and left. The spring pole was built to solve that problem 100 years before rod holders existed. A sapling spring pole is exactly what it sounds like. A young, flexible tree, roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, about waist height on most people, is bent toward the ground and held with a forked trigger stick. A baited line hangs from the tip. When a fish takes the bait and runs, it pulls the trigger free. The sapling snaps upright. The line tightens and the hook sets. No one has to be there. The frontier advantage was arithmetic. One man could set a dozen spring poles along a half-mile of riverbank before dark and check them at first light. 12 lines working through the night on 1 hour of labor. Catfish and bullheads are the primary target because they take bait and move immediately, which trips the trigger. A fish that mouths bait and holds won't set it off. The spring pole works on the same principle as everything else that caught fish consistently on the frontier. Remove the human from the timing equation. The fish does the work. You stop trying to feel the strike and react faster than a wild animal and let physics handle it instead. Worth noting before you start bending saplings in your local creek. Most states prohibit unattended fishing lines. The spring pole as historical technique is well documented. As a modern fishing method, check your regulations first. When a frontiersman lost his metal hooks to a snag, and the Missouri River in 1804 was full of things to snag on, he didn't stop fishing. He braided line from horsehair, mane hair for lighter work, and tail hair for heavier twisting strands together the same way cordage is made. Thorns from hawthorn or honey locust served as hooks, selected for the natural bend near the tip and lashed to a braided hair leader with spruce pitch as adhesive. That setup holds a catfish. Improbably. Completely. You don't need to replicate it, but knowing it's possible reframes what you actually need before you can go fishing. Every individual technique above requires you to carry your bait to where fish already are. Weirs solve that differently. Instead of going to the fish, you change where the fish go. A brush weir redirects fish rather than attracting them. You build a V-shaped fence across a shallow river section. Felled saplings, stakes driven into the muddy bottom, brush bundles weighted with stones, with the open end of the V facing downstream and the point directing current into a narrow gap. A basket trap or net sits at that gap. Fish moving upstream follow the current and the fence until they're channeled through the bottleneck. You aren't luring them. You're intercepting them where they were already headed. Frontier weirs were built from cut timber rather than stone, which meant a functional set could go up in a day instead of the weeks a stone weir required. The technique was passed directly from tribal communities along the Tennessee, Ohio, and Upper Missouri rivers, who had been building them for generations. Frontiersmen adapted the construction to faster travel, since a party that needed to keep moving couldn't afford to spend 2 weeks on anything. The yields are hard to picture by modern fishing standards. A well-placed weir during a spring fish run, when walleye, suckers, and catfish are moving upstream to spawn, could fill a canoe in a morning. That's why weirs are prohibited for most species today. Non-selective, continuous, and effective enough to damage a wild population if left unmanaged. The lesson that survives the regulations is the thinking behind it. The most effective spot on any river isn't where you want to fish. It's where the fish are already going. A weir intercepts a migration. A modern angler who reads a river well enough to find where fish are moving does the same thing with a rod and a legal rig. The weir is illegal. The logic behind it is not. Fish drives worked because someone made the fish move instead of waiting for them. 2 or 3 people enter a shallow section of creek. One group wades and works long branches through the water, pushing panfish, suckers, and small catfish downstream with noise and pressure. The others wait at a natural bottleneck, a gravel bar, a bend where the channel narrows, with a net, a basket, or cupped hands. The disturbance concentrates fish at the choke point. Communal, fast and effective in warm weather on any small stream with shallow water cover. A frontier family working together could work a stretch of creek in an afternoon and eat well that night. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. We've got more of this coming. On a dark frontier river, the men who couldn't afford to wait for daylight built pine knot torches and mounted them on the bows of their canoes. A pine knot is a piece of heartwood cut from a resin-saturated section of pine, usually taken from the base of a dead branch where the resin concentrates deepest. It burns with an orange-yellow flame intense enough to penetrate the water column rather than just illuminate the surface. That distinction matters. A candle or a simple birch bark torch lights the top of the water. A pine knot sends light down into it, and that light draws fish. Walleye, pike, suckers, and catfish that would be invisible in deep current during daylight come up and suspend near the surface in water lit by that flame. The man at the stern paddled without sound. The man at the bow held a gig, which is a multi-pronged spear with barbed tines, 3 or 5 depending on the maker, designed to strike from above at fish near the surface. When a walleye came up into the lit water, he struck. One more thing about pine resin. Burning it produces smoke dense enough to repel mosquitoes, which is some consolation for spending 6 hours in a canoe on the Ohio River in July. Now, I know where this is going. Spearfishing for game fish is banned in most states. Using artificial light to locate and take fish or wildlife at night is a felony charge in many jurisdictions. All of that is true. What's worth sitting with is why it was banned. Not because someone decided it was unfair, but because it worked well enough to cause population declines. Every technique on this list that's now illegal earned its prohibition through pure effectiveness. The underlying biology has not changed. Fish are drawn to light sources at night. You can see this in legal applications right now. Commercial squid boats run high-intensity lights over the side to aggregate squid before a haul. Dock lights on southern lakes pull bass into casting range after dark. The frontier gigging operation was the ancestor of a principle still applied in commercial and recreational fishing today. The method is restricted. The mechanism is not. The spring pole set a line and left it there overnight. Gourd jugging did the same thing, except the line floated. Hollow dried gourds with a hole through the neck and a baited hook and line tied through that hole. Float a dozen of them across a river bend at dusk and leave them until morning. Each gourd acts as a bobber and a drag system simultaneously. When a catfish or large flathead takes the bait and runs, the gourd gets pulled under. Then it pops back to the surface. The fish fights the float over distance and tires itself out instead of running the line to its end and breaking it. You paddle out at first light and collect what you find. If you've ever set a line before dark and lain in your sleeping bag wondering whether something grabbed it overnight, you already understand the patience this method requires, and occasionally rewards. Jug fishing, which uses sealed plastic jugs instead of dried gourds, is still legal in a number of southern states, particularly for catfish in river bends and lake flats. The gourds are different. The principle hasn't changed since frontier fishermen were hollowing them out in fall and storing them through winter. Flathead catfish are the traditional target because they take bait, run hard for 15 or 20 yards, and then settle into structure. The gourd tires the fish during that initial run. By morning, the flathead is near the surface and worn down. Picture a clear, shallow flat in late spring. Knee-deep water, bright morning light, and shapes visible along the sandy bottom below you. Frontier hunters already carried bows every day. Shooting fish with a modified arrow, barbed tip, line tied to the shaft to retrieve both the arrow and the fish, in clear, shallow water was a natural extension of skills they already used. The difficult part wasn't accuracy, it was refraction. Water bends light, which means the fish you see is not where it actually is. A fish visible in a foot of clear water appears higher than its real position. You aim below the image, roughly one full fish length below in a foot of water. Deeper water requires more compensation. Get that calculation consistently right, and a carp or gar in a shallow backwater is a practical food source. Get it consistently wrong, and you go hungry. Bow fishing is legal today in most states for rough fish, carp, and gar. I almost left this one off the list because it isn't a catching technique. But then I thought through what the rest of this list actually means if you can't keep what you catch past the third day, and it changed my mind. Preservation was the calculation that made a good fishing day matter beyond the week it happened. Frontier fishermen split the catch, removed the backbone, and hung the fillets on willow racks or cross-pole frames over a fire built from green-cut hardwood. Green wood produces dense smoke in low flame. The goal was drying the fish rather than cooking it, somewhere between 150 and 175 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly as warm as your hand can tolerate, held 6 inches above the heat source. Smoking ran 24 to 48 hours, depending on the thickness of the fish and the humidity. The result was close to jerky, dense, shelf-stable for months in cool, dry conditions. Cache pits, holes dug below the frost line and lined with elm or birch bark before being sealed with flat stones, kept smoked fish through northern winters without spoilage. It sounds disconnected from catching fish until you think through the math of a frontier winter. You couldn't fish every day. Weather, illness, travel, and the demands of other survival tasks all interrupted the schedule. The men who ate through February weren't the ones who caught the most fish in a single good week. They were the ones who preserved enough during the productive days to carry them through the ones when nothing was possible. Catching fish kept you alive this week. Preserving them kept you alive until March. Of everything on this list, this is the one I'd choose first if I could only keep one technique. A frontier fisherman had no sonar unit, no topo map, no fishing report, no guide service for the river he was standing beside. He had the surface of the water and the shape of the banks around it. What those things told him was enough to put food on a fire, repeatedly, in unfamiliar territory, for months at a time. This is called reading water. What it actually means is understanding what the surface of a river reveals about what's happening on the bottom. A current break is where fast water meets slow water, usually on the downstream side of any obstruction. A boulder, a submerged log, a point of land pushing into the current. That transition zone is where fish hold because they can sit in the slow water and intercept food washing down from the fast side without burning energy fighting the current. It's a natural ambush point. Frontiersmen learned to set gorge hook lines, spring pole sets, and basket traps in current breaks specifically because those locations produced more fish than open water did. Not sometimes. Consistently. Outside bends in rivers are always deeper than inside bends. Current presses against the outside bank and scours the bottom over years, cutting a deeper pool. Large fish, walleye, catfish, pike, stage in those outside bend pools during midday and move into the shallows to feed at dusk and dawn. A man who understood bend geometry could set a jug line or a spring pole at the right location before dark and trust that something would be there by morning. That trust was built on years of watching the same pattern repeat, not on luck. Shade creates temperature breaks, where an overhanging bank, a stand of trees, or a rock face cools a section of water by a few degrees in summer. Fish concentrate. In warm water, those few degrees can be the difference between water fish are comfortable in and water they're avoiding. You don't need a thermometer to find a shade-created thermal break. You need to look at the bank and think about where the sun doesn't reach at noon. The guide on the White River in the Ozarks, a man who'd fished that river for over 50 years, told me he'd give up every piece of tackle he owned in exchange for one ability: walking up to any stretch of unfamiliar water and knowing, before his first cast, where the fish were. He said most fishermen catch fish by accident in good water and call it skill. Reading the river, he said, is what separates catching fish on purpose from catching them when the conditions happen to cooperate. Every technique on this list collapses without this. Gorge hooks in open, featureless water catch nothing. Spring poles set in a straight, shallow channel with no current structure catch nothing. Weirs built where fish don't move catch nothing. The tools are secondary. Knowing where to put them is the whole game, and it was the whole game in 1804, and it is still the whole game now. The men who fed their families through frontier winters weren't carrying anything special. Half of them were fishing with improvised tackle that would embarrass a first-year angler today. What they had was years of watching what rivers do and understanding why fish behave the way they do inside moving water. They didn't need a fish finder to know the fish were holding on the outside bend. They looked at the current, read the bank, and put their line in the right place. That still catches fish. It always did.